Pandemic and protest, two major stories have upended how we live and how we relate to each other. Amid another week of protests in our streets, a new KPBS investigation into use of force by local police, and a discussion on why so many members of our community distrust law enforcement. Plus, how San Diego flattens the curve of the COVID-19 pandemic as our economy carefully reopens. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now.
¿Qué onda, friends? In this episode of Port of Entry, we wanted to share the live event experience we hosted together last year as part of the World Design Experience with special guests Charles Glaubitz and Giancarlo Ruiz. You don't want to miss this two-part episode of our live event. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts. Nos vemos pronto.
Welcome back to the Roundtable, our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, our show has been off the air for more than 3 months. We're back, radio only for now, and we're doing an interview format instead of a panel since my guests and I are all working from home for now. Still, it's good to be back, and my guests today are KPBS investigative reporter Claire Trageser, reporter Maya Sri Krishnan, a voice of San Diego, and KPBS medical reporter Taryn Mento. First up today, it took legal action by KPBS and other news outlets to get internal investigations into the use of force from police agencies in San Diego County. So far, 130 investigations dating to 2001 reveal if a suspect is a person of color, he's far more likely to face deadly force than if he's white. KPBS investigative reporter Claire Trageser joins me now. Claire, welcome.
Thank you.
First, explain by what we mean when we say deadly force and other means of force police may use in dealing with suspects that they deem to be threatening.
Right. So in these incidents, for the records that they are releasing, there's, a number of different options that police might take when dealing with someone, including they can use tasers, they can use a canine or a police dog, they can use rubber bullets or bean bags, and then, of course, they can also choose to shoot someone. So those are the different options that we kind of broke down in this data.
Now, why is it so difficult for reporters and the public to get details of incidents where police use deadly force?
Right. So up until the beginning of last year, it was pretty much impossible in California to get any of these records because they were all protected under state law. But a new state law called SB 1421 went into effect January 2019, and it said that now police have to release their internal investigations and their video and their audio, everything that they have about these particular, not everything, but these specific incidents where an officer fires a gun or uses use of force that results in serious injury. And then there's also sustained findings of sexual abuse or lying during the course of an investigation. But we looked at just at the serious use of force and the shootings. And again, like you said, when we started, when the law went into effect, at first, police unions tried to argue that it didn't apply retroactively, so it would only mean that records going forward would have to be released. But that, was taken up in court, and courts decided, yes, they do have to actually release past records as well. So they didn't start releasing until maybe March or April of last year, and now have been releasing the records for about a year.
And what did the examination of these 130 investigations turned over so far show specifically?
Right. So we down between people of color and white people, and it really showed that among the records that we have so far, that when police are dealing with a person of color, they're more likely to shoot, and when they're dealing with a white person, they're more likely to use an alternative type of force like a police dog or a taser or something like that. And again, as I say in the story, we don't have all of the records yet. Police agencies are still going through past records. They say that it takes a lot of time to review and redact the records, and so they slowly are rolling them out. And so we have about a third of the total records the agencies say that they have. So this is just a preliminary look at what they've released, and that's what the data shows so far.
And you interviewed use of force experts and trainers with the San Diego police. What's their attitude about why violent incidents with suspects tend to happen?
Yeah, so back last year, we went to both a community outreach event with the San Diego Police Department and just interviewed trainers, use of force trainers, and they talked about, you know, that if people just listen to police officers, that they wouldn't have to use force, and that they call a force matrix where they choose what response they're making based on what the person is doing. One of the officers, was a lot more colorful in his descriptions, where he said things like, if you just did what I told you to do, we wouldn't have any problems. And what happened, when did officers become the suspects, and suspects become the victims. So it's I think that those attitudes maybe are now being challenged and called into question more based on recent events, but that was what we heard from officers when we talked to them.
And you also interviewed a community activist who they say, and those in the minority community see it quite differently. What did she have to say?
Right. So she says, I mean, first of all, anytime you say, what happened to our society, why can't things be like they used to be, to a person of color, that's a pretty controversial statement, because the way things used to be for people of color was even worse than they are now. But she also just said that her experience with police officers in her area where she lives in Southeast San Diego is often just immediately confrontational, where officers are jumping out of the car and yelling at people. And so, she would like to see officers just initially, right off the bat, take a different approach that doesn't immediately lead to more of, an aggressive encounter.
Right, quite a different attitude. And police in San Diego have reacted quickly in the past week following protests and the news of the George Floyd death, of course, out of Minneapolis. And in other cities across the nation, they've moved quickly this week. What changes have been made here in San Diego?
Right. So things have been happening very rapidly. Changes that people have been asking for a really long time are all of a sudden happening. So it started, I think, with the San Diego Police Department announced that they're no longer going to use the carotid restraint, which is commonly known as the chokehold. And then the Sheriff's Department first said they were still going to use it, but then said that they weren't going to use it. And then, by the end of that day, I think every local law enforcement agency said they are going to ban the use of the carotid restraint. And then just this week, the San Diego Police Department also said that they are going to now adopt a use of force, a de-escalation policy, which is something that a community review board has been trying to get done for 2 years, I think. So all of a sudden, it seems like there's this moment where, law enforcement agencies are willing to make some of these changes.
Is there an example of a city where major reforms have taken place, noticeable improvements were realized regarding police and the use of force against minorities?
Well, in my story, the third segment of my story, I went up to Berkeley, California, and they have had a de-escalation policy and training for about 4 years. So they've really had time for it to take effect, and they view it, instead of the way San Diego is doing it, is they just add on 10 extra hours of de-escalation training. Berkeley, they are reevaluate all of their policies with de-escalation in mind. So in every encounter, how can we approach someone in a way that's not going to aggravate them? Instead of jumping out of a car and yelling at someone, you kind of stand back. And it's also about officer safety. So maybe you use your squad car as cover, so you don't get into a situation where you are then threatened and have to use force. And it seems like, I mean, they haven't had an officer involved shooting in 8 years, I think. It's pretty effective there. Although it's also interesting because, if you talk to activists in the Berkeley area, they say, sure, that's fine, but, we still want more. We really want to reevaluate how policing is done completely. Police shouldn't be making stops for mental health issues. It should be other people, kind of this defund the police narrative that you hear going on right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of angles and issues to this, and I'm sure we'll be covering much more of this in the future and talking about it on the roundtable. Well, I've been speaking with KPBS investigative reporter Claire Tregeser. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thank you.
¿Qué onda, friends? In this edition of Port of Entry, we are telling the story of Charles and Giancarlo, two compadres who recently put together a graphic novel titled The Fracture. Along with this podcast episode, we are premiering Port of Entry Shorts, small video capsules of the stories we put together, and we have two to share. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts. Nos vemos pronto!
We turn now to the story that's dominated the news worldwide in 2020, the coronavirus and the disease it causes. Joining me is KPBS health reporter Taryn Mento. Hi, Taryn.
Hey, Mark.
Well, after 3 months, we're seeing more of San Diego County opening up finally. Tell us a bit about what's back open this week.
Right. Well, earlier this week, we got better access to beaches. Parking lots were opening up, and all activities, as long as cities were okay with it, were allowed to be happening on the shores. You know, group activities like volleyball, of course, as long as you are playing with members of your household. Also, RV parks and day camps and campgrounds were cleared to open up. And Friday, other businesses, you know, gyms can open up, pools can open up, hotels can open up. You know, a lot of those higher risk facilities can open up as long as they're adhering to state guidance. And, you know, we've made some progress. I think 2.5, maybe 3 weeks ago now, restaurants have opened up, and we haven't seen major spikes tied to those reopenings. And that's giving the county confidence to keep moving forward.
Now, as more places open up, what's that say about the work done to flatten the curve here locally?
You know, we hear county officials say that we've done that. We have flattened the curve. But the thing that they keep saying is it's only been done because we have all been vigilant and we've been responsible and we've been taking the actions that they've been telling us to take. Washing our hands, staying home when we need to, socially distancing. And they want to make sure that, yes, things are opening up, but that doesn't mean that you can stop doing these things that have allowed us to get to the point where we can open up. And, you know, at any one point, the flatten the curve that can go to the wayside, and we can see increases in spikes. So we have those triggers that the county is tracking to let us know when we are seeing those case counts, those hospitalizations, and some other metrics start to change.
And more testing is available now compared to when this all started in March or February, a little before that. Is the county meeting its goals for testing? And if not, what are the challenges?
So the county is definitely reaching its goals on some days, but it does fluctuate. I think they set them the goal of 5,200 daily tests. Now, some days we've reached that because we have heard that some sites are, you know, providing results in batches. So, you know, maybe they didn't provide results after a couple of days. So a batch comes through. So that sends the daily test total way up. But the goal that they're trying to hit is 4,950, because that would be a certain metric that they told the state that they would be hitting. And they're getting right around there, and they're continuing to get higher and higher every single day. They still want to meet 5,200 every single day. They said they would do it around early June, and they're getting there. But the challenges are still those old supply line challenges we've heard in the past, specifically reagents.
And over the past few weeks, the protests of police brutality have generated big crowds. Is the county closely watching this lack of social distancing in these crowds, how it might affect the progress that we've made so far with COVID-19?
Right. Yeah, they are really closely paying attention to kind of, 2 weeks out from when the demonstrations started happening, which is the incubation period for this illness. After about 2 weeks after the exposure is when you should see symptoms. And so they're paying attention. Are we seeing more people testing positive? And then from that, are we seeing more people, become hospitalized? And so they're making sure that when they do get positive cases, they're asking people, the contact tracing, they're asking people if they were involved in these demonstrations. And so that way they can start to trace it back and see if it was connected to, these kind of mass gatherings. So far, they said that they haven't seen that, but it is really early in that period of time. So they're monitoring it. So far, not yet, but they're still a little cautious, and they're encouraging people, if you have been at a demonstration, look back to how long it's been and consider getting a test. But they also say, even if you did test negative for that one point in time, that just means that day, you didn't have enough of the virus in your system to test positive. So also consider getting another test later. But I will say that, we did have demonstrations back in April. They were smaller, but we did have demonstrations against the stay home orders. We saw fewer people wearing masks. And in these demonstrations, I've been out there, I've seen a lot of people wearing masks on some of the invites to these demonstrations. They've been encouraging masks. There are people in the crowd handing out sanitizer. So it's definitely mass gatherings, not socially distancing by 6 feet by any means, but they're doing what they can to prevent any further spread.
Mass and mask gatherings, as we're talking about here. And you're the KPBS health reporter, but all of us have been called on to cover these protests. What are your general takeaways to what you've seen out there? What's it been like covering two major stories simultaneously?
It's been interesting being at these demonstrations. Early on, we saw, some things turn violent. You saw looting, you saw those fires, and within days from that, days after the La Mesa demonstration, I went to a demonstration I think they said it was like thousands of people that were marching around North Park and through Balboa Park. And what was so fascinating is that it was literally teenagers that were leading that. And I have seen those same, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 23-year-old, a college student, they were leading this. And I've seen those same leaders at later demonstrations, and they very, very specifically laid down certain ground rules to not have those violent incidents take place. And they were encouraging people to be respectful of anyone that they encountered, referencing the homeless, to be respectful of the earth and to not litter. I literally saw a leader with a megaphone yell at somebody for dropping what was a piece of paper, encouraging them to pick it up. They've also encouraged people to, not put themselves in situations and not engage in certain situations with the police that could lead to some sort of response on either side. When that march that went through Balboa Park, and it was of thousands, they marched all the way to downtown police headquarters. And when they arrived, there was a lot of police there. And police had said it was because they didn't want to see what happened at SDPD, what had happened in La Mesa. But instead of the crowd going to the police, they stayed a block away and encouraged everyone to remain far away, to never put themselves in a position where there would be any sort of reaction from either side. So it's been really interesting to see young people work together to make some specific rules that prevented it ever taking away from their main message, which is they want racial justice, and they want to continue to have that heard and not have the violence that we saw earlier take away from that. So that's what's been most fascinating to me. And as I mentioned earlier, the emphasis on protection amid the pandemic. They're wearing masks. There's a group of nurses that go out and follow with these groups, and they hand out masks. They're providing hand sanitizer. So it's been interesting the last week and a half that I've been following these 2 weeks, that it's very organized and doing their best to make sure that the message is heard and nothing else.
Well, it's a fast-moving story. Both of them are fast-moving stories, and lots of evolution in each to be sure going forward. I've been speaking with KPBS health reporter Taryn Mento. Thanks very much, Taryn.
Thanks, Mark.
Moving now to a story about mistrust and fear of police. It's about how many residents in one of San Diego's most diverse neighborhoods are reluctant to call police to intervene on a problem like homeless individuals interfering with local businesses, a call business owners in other communities don't hesitate to make. Maya, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, your story focuses on San Diego's District 4. Why is this part of the city significant in the history of police relations locally?
So District 4 is one of the most diverse communities in the city, probably in the county. It also has a Black population of about 15%. So it has one of the highest concentrations of Black constituents in the city. And it is a very heavily policed area.
And a lot of Hispanic residents there too as well, right?
Yes. Latinos do make up the largest proportion, I think about 40%.
Your story starts with the community coming together to think of solutions for the adverse effects homelessness was having on nearby businesses. How does this illustrate the hesitancy some have to call the police for help?
So I was at this community meeting when they were discussing this issue, and it was really fascinating to me that this sort of debate arose. There were, some of the owners of businesses who were like, we really need to do something about this because it's hurting our business. But there was a big hesitancy from a lot of people in the room about calling the police for help, which I think is what many other residents and business owners do when they're trying to deal with homeless individuals outside of their businesses. And it was really interesting because they weren't necessarily worried about, how the police would interact with the homeless population. That was part of it, but a really big part of it was also how additional police presence would impact other people in the neighborhood because it is already a very policed area. And so there were parents there who expressed concerns that, they were worried while their kid was walking to and from Lincoln High that they might get stopped too, just because there's additional police presence.
And it's something you'd think if you were sitting in a similar community meeting in some other part of San Diego, it wouldn't even occur to you that they would be hesitant to call the police in that situation.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I think there's been plenty of stories and documentation about business owners downtown is the best example, calling the police to kind of help with homeless enforcement so that it doesn't disrupt their businesses.
And Maya, you profile several members of the community and their personal stories about when they first had interactions with San Diego police. What were some of the common threads you heard in that?
So one of the things that really struck me as I was speaking to everyone was that everyone's first memories of interacting with police officers happened when they were really young. They all happened when they were minors. And that was very stunning to me, not having grown up in an area like that. I think that many other communities and many other people, if it was just a norm that 6-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 14-year-old would get stopped by the police for questioning or things like that, that would be, obscene to them.
Right. And one person you spoke with is Tony Wiggins. He described his experience in seeing a much lighter police presence in wealthier neighborhoods like La Jolla that he was familiar with. How does that anecdotal experience feed into this culture of mistrust?
So I think for a long time, maybe many of the people in this community who were getting policed so heavily didn't realize that they were being treated differently than other places. And, more recently, I think we've seen data and records that have shown that indeed, Black San Diegans are disproportionately targeted by police for searches. They are disproportionately victims of officer-involved shootings. But I think for him, it was this anecdotal experience of what I thought was normal was not normal in these other places.
Yeah, it must have been an eye-opener listening to some of the other folks in the community talking about the same thing for him.
Yeah.
Now, the national conversation right now is rooted in the experiences that minority communities have with police. How did current events motivate your decision to do this story?
I mean, as everyone knows, there have been, days and days of protests over the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis and, included in San Diego. And one of the things I really wanted to do was for all the people who suddenly are very interested in policing is give them a look at how it's happening in some of these communities in our own backyard.
San Diego is one of the pioneer cities in community officer policing and the storefront policing. That goes back a couple of decades, at least in San Diego. You would think that maybe in a community like District 4 that we're talking about, they would have a history there, maybe some more trust, maybe officers of color more assigned to patrol there, but that's not the sense I got from your story.
I mean, that's not the sense that I got from residents.
So that the mistrust, as you say, just goes back to childhood forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, this wasn't in my story, it didn't end up making it into my story, but, they did draw lines between, there are community officers whose job it is to build rapport with the community, but there are other units, like the Special Operations Unit, formerly the Gang Suppression Unit, who have a very different job, and they approach people in that community much more aggressively and fairly regularly as well.
Now, I wanted to segue into other big story right now, COVID-19, of course, and the work that you've done on that. And your reporting is focused on South Bay. Is there an explanation for why those communities have a higher number of cases of coronavirus there?
There are quite a few explanations. I think don't really know if there's one that is more valid than the other. But one, I think a lot of local leaders in South Bay have made the case that many of their residents are essential workers. And so they have been people who have still been continuing to be out and about when everyone else has been lockdown and working remotely. And therefore, they've been more exposed to the virus.
And I was going to make the point that the proximity to the border, Mexico's had a different experience than the United States in some regards than California. And a lot of the border, I know, has been restricted and shut down to a large extent, but not entirely, right?
Yes. So what we've been seeing in South Bay hospitals and in hospitals in Imperial County is that many U.S. citizens or U.S. residents who have been living in Baja California have been crossing over for medical care as they have contracted COVID-19. So there are reports of very high percentages of those hospitals, COVID cases, having spent time recently in Mexico or being residents in Mexico. So that is another factor. And then there's also, the zip code that has shown the highest rate of growth that's been far higher than the rest of the county is one that includes Otay Mesa. And of course, the Otay Mesa Immigration Detention Center has had a huge outbreak. And all of those cases are counted in that zip code as well. So there's a few different reasons why those numbers are different than the rest of the county.
Right. And as you say, South Bay has really seen a higher incidence than many other parts of San Diego County.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if their curve is flattening in the same way as the overall county.
I've been speaking with Maya Sri Krishnan, reporter for Voice of San Diego. Thanks, Maya, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That wraps up another week of stories on the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Claire Tregeser of KPBS News, Maya Sri Krishnan of the Voice of San Diego, and Taryn Mento, also of KPBS. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for being with us today, and join us again next week on the Roundtable.
Now on The Finest, we examine an icon. Our Lady of Guadalupe has been a powerful symbol for 500 years, and artists have reimagined her as a source of resilience and pride. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.